Joanna, my daughter, told me she was doing great and that her husband, Todd, was the sweetest man in the world. He always rushed to make her coffee in the morning, never letting her move around the house, and when it rained, he would pick her up and cook homemade chicken soup, and whenever she had a mood swing, he would do his goofy husband dance just to make her laugh. I listened and smiled as naturally as I could, but my fingers gripped the edge of my phone the entire time we were on that video call. Her face was pale, fair-skinned or light. It was the kind of pale you see under the fluorescent lights of a hospital room. Her lips curled into a smile, but her eyes were dull and vacant, as if someone had turned off the lights inside her. This was the third time she had said, "I caught the flu, so I'm at the hospital." The previous time, she had tripped down the stairs. The most cautious person I've ever met, she used to hold on to the railing in order to go down a few steps. She said, "There's no way she would have just fallen. And the stoma pains were bad enough for 4 fluids. Choked it too much dessert last night. I've been a mother for too long to fall for that, and I know the sound of a lie told to keep me from worrying." Tangled in guilt and fear, she said, with a soft little laugh, "I'm okay. You okay? Stop overthinking odded, but didn't press. If I don't ask, she'll co-talking and dalking, the more I can piece things together." She was faster than I had anticipated, though, and concluded with a quiet, "I should go grab some theat. Let's talk later." The moment the screen went black, I felt a weight settle in my chest. She claims to be happy, but I don't believe her. That night, when I called my son Jason, he was half asleep, pressing buttons on his game controller while responding to me. "Mom, you're over at it. Didn't Joanna already tell you a few times? F times Todd treats her well, Lee well, and they're fine. Anki Fishy's at check always in the hospital." I asked, "Don't you find that strange?" Jason shrugged, and I could hear in his voice, "She'd at check always stomachachus aches when she was a child. That's just the way she is," he said, laughing. "Besides Todd, Todd, the awkward andashy ard shy, definitely not the type to hurt anyone." I answer. He didn't notice yet. He laughed and said, "Wait, you're not thinking about driving there, are you?" I said, "I'm thinking about it," which caused him to pause. His tone changed. Hanged. "Wait, you're not actually serious, Jason." I was sitting under the kitchen light with my hand resting on a printed bus ticket. And she was my daughter. A mother knows when her child is lying, just like a bird knows when the wind is about to change. But she told me not to come. She told me she was fine, and I interrupted her times. Each time her eyes darted a little more. He then went silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. The following morning, I didn't tell Joanna, I didn't tell anyone I took a long-distance bus to Cedar Falls. I didn't bring anything to alarm anyone, just 3 changes of clothes, a small notebook, and a black handbag. Inside were some cash, my driver's license, and 30 years of mother's intuition. She told me she was fine, but she was in a hospital. He told me she had fallen, but she was limping, and her eyes were like a startled deer, wide and glossy and scared. She didn't tell me because she didn't want me to worry, but I couldn't sleep until I knew the truth, so I went in search of it. When I got there, I didn't go straight to her apartment. Instead, I checked into a small motel across the street. The front desk clerk gave me a cheerful smile, and I returned the favor, just visiting my daw. I didn't even know if I'd get to see her in her apartment building in Willow Creek, which had scale security cameras on every corner and a doorman at the front desk. I wasn't in a hurry, so I could wait. I found a seat on the patio of a cafe across the street, ordered latte with a latte milk without sugar, and sipped slowly for an hour. As the sun started to set, I texted Joanna, "What are you up to, sweetheart?" She responded almost immediately, "Working late, Momeen. Mom, don't worry about me." But I had been watching that front due afternoon, turnoon, and Joanna hadn't left the house, not even a shadow. When I returned at 9 that evening, I was standing directly on the front steps of her building, my eyes fixed on the entrance, not daring to blink when I heard a husky, sharp-edged, suspicious voice behind me say, "Hey, you're with the FBI or something." I almost leaped, spun around, and found myself staring at an elderly woman in pajama pants, fuzzy slippers, and a silk robe, with silver hair piled high on her head in one hand. She held a cat leash, But she leaned in as if we were exchanging government secrets. Or perhaps you're a private investigator who has been observing you sin afternoon turnoon girl. Even the neighbor's dog doesn't stake out this building like you do, girl. I couldn't help but laugh, but she clapped her hands and said, "No more. I support you if you're here to catch a cheater, and I won't say a word because I can't stand that man in 4B who is always smoking on the balcony late at night like he owns the building." The next morning, I laughed again, and for the first time in 2 days, she held out her hand. Her name was Madison Dawson, and she said, "I'm here to prot daughter, otter, and I'm trying to find the truth." Her eyes sharpened with a flicker of understanding, and her tone odded, but said nothing more, and she dropped on the stone steps next to me, thoughtful. I knew something was wrong with that unit lately. My brie caught what you heard? She leaned in a little last Wednesday, maybe around 2 in the morning. I was up getting water, but I didn't fully lock the balcony door, and I heard voices outside. At first, I thought it was just a couple fighting, but then she hesitated, her voice dropping, and then some crashing shing, and a woman sobby pleading adding, made my fingers instinctively curl into fists. Margie turned to face me, and her voice said, "Gentling your daughter." She seemed like the type of person who would keep her pain to herself. It's a shame this place looks upscale, but trust me, it's full of men. I walk my cat around the building 3 times a day, and even though I'm not very quick on my feet, I've got ears every whenever. When Houseplant gets watered, I can't help but laugh again, and he smiled. "I'll be out front tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock catching the sun. If you need information, just come find me. Than Margie. Doggy, don't thank me. I'm just doing my duty for justice," she said, sitting up straighter with mock pride. Then she leaned in and wisputed, "But really, that man gives me the creeps." I knew he was bad news, even though his eyebrows looked like those of a TV villain. I laughed again, and for the first time, I didn't feel completely alone. I didn't return to the motel that night. Instead, I spent the entire evening in a nearby 24-hour diner. The lighting was dim, but still bright enough for me to see the sticky note on it, which was Joanna's apartment access code. She had mentioned it casually, and once I wrote it down, I never thought I'd actually use it, but the voice in my head was growing louder and clearer. I couldn't even count the number of times I checked the front of the building that day. Perhaps the 7th time, Margie gently tapped my arm and whispered, "He's gone gray suit, rye suit carconned, in hand looks like he left in a hurry, left shoe untied." I looked up at her, who appeared even more energized than she had yesterday. Dressed in a clean sweater, and I could smell a hint of the hallway was eerily quiet, like walking through a tunnel lined with thick velvet. The elevator ride felt slower than the day before, and I could hear my own heartbeat. When I reached her floor, I stood in front of her door for a moment before entering the code without knocking. "Perfume. Perfume you going in?" she asked. I nodded, sealing the code from the sticky note into memory. Margie leaned closer, lowering her voice. "If you're not out in 30 minutes, I'm calling the cops," she said, lowering my voice. I managed a weak smile that makes you my most dependable backup. When I opened the bedroom door, Joanna was sitting at the edge of the bed with her BME. Her hair was a tangled mess draped over her shoulders. A bandage was wrapped around her right ankle, which was severely swollen, and her hands clutched the blanket. The apartment was dim, with the only light coming from a blue glow in the corner, an air purifier humming softly. The curtains were closed. The air was stale, heavy with the smell medicine icing and something faintly rotten. A bowl of dried soup was on the coffee table, with a few strands Oaklinginger cling bottom autumn, and a few strands Oaklinginger cling to the edges of the sofa cushions, and everything felt lifeless. A wedding photo was hung on the wall, and Joanna smiled stiffly. Todd looked into the camera with a suspicious, almost protective expression, as if he was guarding something. "Like it was the only thing holding her to safety, Joanna," I whispered. When she turned around, I nearly started crying. Her face was gaunther, lips colorless under her left eye, and a bruise that was still yellowing but visible. Her eyes were soft and gray, dulled to ash, but when she saw me, panic rushed in to replace it. Her voice was hoarse, like sand scraping against her throat. Stepped forward and gently wrapped my arms around her, and she recoiled a little. If he finds out he lose it, he'll go crazy, Joa cupped. I caressed her face in my hands. She lowered her head and started to cry, one by one, onto the back of my hand. He locked the door from the outside. She whispered, unplugged my phone's landline, and said, "He only lets me call approved numbers. I'm only allowed to FaceTime you from the hospital because he knows there'll be people around. That's the only reason he lets me do that." Her voice went so low that I had to lean into him, but he told them I was unstable when the officers gave me water, so he had slipped something to it, my sedatives. He then made me sign a guardianship consent form, threatening to institutionalize me if I didn't cooperate. As she spoke, she buried her face deeper into the blanket. I was burning up with a fever. The nurse brought in a bunch of forms, and he stood right next to me, watching. Even read what I was signing later, but when I resisted, he showed me the documents that stated that I had given him legal authority as my psychiatric guardian, allowing him to have me admitted against my will. I felt the room tilt around me. He hadn't just hit her. Instead, he had wrapped her in an illegal noose, polished and invisible, wrapped in concern. 2 weeks ago, he pushed me down the stairs, and she told the doctor that she was just clumsy. But the doctor could tell. He said that if I opened my mouth, he would have someone hurt you. Her lips Quimomed Mom, and I was so terrified that I thought he might actually come after you. I didn't want anything to happen to you, so I reached up and gently smoothed her hair. "You don't need to worry, sweetheart. You can't touch me. Everything you could, Joanna. You're stronger than you think, and here, I'm going to protect you." Her voice wavered. I had been to the hospital once, but he made the doctor sign a confidentiality agreement. One of the nurses gave me a copy of the report, which I hid, but my eyes grew sharp. She then gestured toward the nightstand. I opened the drawer and discovered a torn folder boulder stuffed in the back under an old scarf. Inside, I discovered a worn medical report from 2 weeks ago that stated that she had fractured her right ankle, most likely due to external force. I carefully folded it, put on my coat, put on some shoes, and we're leaving right now, Cobb-linked. Linked, the soon better, Margie's going. As we arrived at the apartment door, we heard the ding of an elevator alert followed by a buzz. Ch-buzz. The display above read out of service maintenance. I clenched my jaw and turned toward the stairs, one step at a time. Carrying her down each flight felt like hammering another nail into my spine, and my arms shook and my breath came in bursts, but I had never before done this. To stop the front desk, I slipped my coat over her shoulders and grabbed a scarf from the couch and wrapped it around her neck. When she tried to stand, she cried out in pain. Her entire body tensed, and I couldn't even stand. Felt more confident in my life. Her cheek rested on my shoulder, and she said, "I'm sorry, Mom," in a whisper that was barely above breath. I bit my lip to keep from crying, and all I could say was, "You, daughter? Oder, you never have to apologize for needing help." I carried her, my girl who used to laugh so freely, away from the thing that had been told was a marriage. We arrived at the lobby, and I was about to push through the doors when the front desk clerk called out, "Ma'am, are you all right? You don't look so good." I forced a smile. "Thanks for asking." "This is my daughter, and he had a little blood sugar. Drop. I'm just getting her home to rest," and he looked like he might press further. She called out, Come on, I've been waiting forever." And then she turned to the clerk, grabbing his attention. "Young man, can you help me check if my cat snuck out the back door again? You know how fast she is." While he was preoccupied, I limped us through the doors, one arm around Joanna's back, the other guiding us around the corner where our rental car was waiting. I opened the back door and gently helped her into the seat, and she clung to my arm, eyes closed, lips moving. Moving. Mom, you really came," she whispered. I tightened the blanket around her, kissed her forehead, and said, "I swear, sweetheart, no one is ever going to hurt you again." 10 minutes later, Todd arrived home, humming a song, holding a bag of takeout in one hand, tapped the keypad, and pushed the door open. But Joanna didn't respond. I drove all the way to Spring Hill, a town so small that it doesn't even have a Starbucks, but it holds clearest, callous skies and the most familiar air. I could drive every street and turn every corner with my eyes closed, and Joanna sat in the passenger seat silent the entire time, her face turned toward the window, the wind tossing her hair. But nothing could lift the shadow in her eyes. By the time we got home, the sky was beginning to fade into dusk. The blanket from the bed was gone, the closet door was wide open, the drawers were empty, and the report folder was still on the coffee table, but its contents were missing. His voice reverberated through apartment, loud and furious, but this time no one responded. She used to complain that there was no Wi-Fi signal in the backyard, but now that she was standing in the doorway like a bird that had barely returned to her nest, she just leaned against the frame and stared for a long time. I changed the bed, linens, and made her favorite creamy chicken soup the way she loved it as a child. That night, she didn't go into the bedroom. Instead, she curled up on the old sofa in the corner of my room, wrapped in a blanket, and fell asleep around midnight. I woke up to the sound of her murmuring in her sleep, and I moved closer, straining to hear her voice, which was faint. "Don't. Low door. A door. I swear I won't run." I sat next to her, took her hand in mine, and stayed there the rest of the night without closing my eyes. The nurse on duty community clinic in town was Tracy, an old friend of mine with a sharp tongue, sharper instincts, and someone I trusted with my life. "You actually brought her back," she muttered as she put on her gloves. A few days ago, she saw her husband on Facebook posting pictures of him as a devoted husband, saying he was some saint, all lies. I told Tracy, and she rolled her eyes. Knowing that trash guy that haddock, that narcissism in every step they took. She checked Joanna's ankle, and her expression turned grim. "This isn't a sprain. It's a blunt force from a fall. Your daughter didn't trip. Someone did this to—" Nodded. "I didn't anything, Tracy. And I need your assistance finding." She raised an eyebrow when I said, "I want proof that she was treated at Cedar Falls Memorial." "You won't, not through the front door, but I can poke around the edges of the system and see what's hanging out in the corners." I handed her the torn medical report, and she bent over it, her fingers tracing Al-Fayed paper code matching. From the look of it, my heart stopped, second in neurosurgery. She didn't tell me that, frowned. "You want me to reach out to the attending physician? I can dig up a name." I closer. "Do you know anyone there?" asked. "Do you know anyone on the inside off the books?" Before lowering her voice. "Transferred there last year, working the front desk in the ear." I felt like I could finally breathe again. "I just need records, dates, prescription names, and even a screenshot. If I can get that, I can take it to a lawyer." Tracy nodded, but, "Be careful. If that man has a brain, he'll start tracing you too." I gripped the torn report tighter and said, "Flat and cold, then let's see who moves faster." Tracy kept her word, and the next afternoon she texted me, "There's a recoin take. Intake and imaging data are in the system." I was sitting on a bench in my backyard when I opened it, my hands shaking, and the image loaded. It was grainy, but I didn't need it to be sharp. I instantly recognized Joanna's name and the date. I didn't need to ask why Todd would never have allowed her to complete the test after she slipped and fell. The screenshot showed a scheduled scan marked incomplete. What did that mean? It meant that her injuries had never been fully documented, but the system had a registration record, so that was enough. I told Tracy to contact the doctor who saw Joanna and ask if they would be willing to call me that evening. My phone rang, and the voice on the other end was calm, measured, professional, but gentle. This is Dr. Patrick from the Cedar Falls Memorial, ER. I was the attending physician that night when your daughter reported falling, but we had suspicions of possible domestic violence because of her evasive behavior and her refusal to name anyone involved. As a result, we only logged a preliminary report later, and her husband called to cancel the follow-up appointment, and I gripped the phone tightly. He said that only the patient could request a copy of the preliminary report with a signed release form. I understand your situation, and I can prepare an informal treatment summary, just a basic note describing her condition. It won't carry legal weight, but it will be something I understand. I said that's all I need for now, and I'll write it by hand on pestationery. Ionary. He said, I'll fax it directly, no hospital system involved. I knew what that meant, and I thanked him. As I hung up, I felt the slightest sense of relief. But at the same time, miles away in Cedar Falls, Todd stood frozen in his face wagranite. Ranit, the apartment had been apart. Apart, the drawers were open. Open, the couch cushion flipped. Lipped, the floor beneath the bed was clean. Clean, but the one thing he was looking for, the medical report he'd vowed Joanna was never permitted to copy, was gone. He picked up his phone and called building security. Didn't you mention that the building had round-the-clock surveillance? His voice was low and seething, so he pulled the footage Tuesday night between 8 and 9. I want to see who entered that front door and who went down my hallway. He hung up and reached for a sticky note on the counter, a string of numbers written in faded ink that was familiar but not quite his own. Joanna had mentioned that number in passing once, just in case Mom ever needed to come. I gave her a code, and Todd's eyes went cold. When I returned inside, Joanna was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, looking out the window. Her eyes were clearer now, less foggy, and less afraid when she saw me. She asked softly, Mom, are you Andy? And I sat down next to her, pulling out the screenshot, sweetheart, and we got our first piece of evidence. She didn't say anything, just leaned over and rested her head on my shoulder. We've still got a long road ahead, I whispered, but I promise you're not walking it alone anymore. She nodded gently, and I was about to say something else when my phone buzzed. It was Atax Margie, a curious man, had just called my house, said, he's looking for your daughter. His tone was off, but she didn't need to. I knew Todd faster than I had anticipated. I didn't show Joanna the message because she had just started eating again and needed to sleep through the night without waking. Up in a panic. Instead, I calmly put the phone away, got up, and closed all the curtains in the house. I locked the kitchen door, then leaned into the front door and threw deadbolts. D-bolt. This house didn't have fancy security, but when it came to keeping danger out, every click of metal was comforting. Then I went to the bedroom, opened an old storage box, dug all the way to the bottom, took out a weathered address book, and leafed through the pages until I found the name, Dr. Patrick. I dialed the number listed, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message in your private inbox saying, Hello, Dr. Patrick. This is Joanna's mother. I received a warning from a friend that someone is looking for us. I'm not sure if he'll try to contact you, but if he does, please tell him that you have no authorization to release any medical information. I need you now to hold on to every document and note. I'll be at the hospital in person tomorrow morn 10. After I hung up, I pretended everything was normal. I made breakfast as usual, fried the eggs, added extra black pepper, and tapped. The lid a little louder than necessary, just enough for Joanna to hear me in the kitchen. Just enough to let her know that someone was still here and that she wasn't alone. She came out of her room wearing a new sweater and said, "I've been thinking maybe I should report him." I paused, caught off guard, and she nodded before shaking her head. I just know that running is an answer. But I'm scared if I do him, or him, he'll get worse. I sat down next to her, speaking quietly but firmly. "And we're going to gather all the evidence. We'll seal it in an envelope and put it somewhere safe so that when you're ready, whether it's calling the police or seeing an attorney, you'll have what you need reaping around the rims." "Did something happen?" she whispered. "You feel different today?" I hesitated, then told her the truth. "Nothing happened, sweetie. You're safe, I promise. Just leave the rest to me." For a long, quiet moment, we waited. Meanwhile, in the middle of Spring Hill, a gray sedan slowly moved down Main Street. Todd sat behind the wheel, one arm resting on the open window, eyes scanning the sleepy storefronts and tree-lined sidewalks. He had spent the entire morning asking around for my address, not directly, of course, but rather learning layout and watching outside the local pharmacy when he saw me leaving with a small bag of first aid supplies in hand. The car. He just lifted his phone, took a picture, and typed, "She's in Spring Hill." But instead of sending the message, he erased it. That evening after dinner, I sat down next to Joanna and said, "Sweetheart, I called my cousin. She has a guest house out near Eugene, and there's a vacancy this week. Quiet place, Beeviews." "Views? I thought maybe you could go there 4 days and you days get some rest." Joanna paused. "You want me to know, Tav? No, just for a little while." I started folding clothes bag. A bag. "I don't feel right letting you stay here any longer," scowled. Cowled. "You said that Spring Hill was safe." I wasn't lying. I looked her in the eyes. "What about you?" I gave her a small smile and said, "I'll stay behind and tie up loose ends. You know that's always been my specialty." She looked at me as if she wanted to argue, but she just nodded. The following morning, I used a neighbor's name to book her, a bus ticket, and when Joanna got on the bus, I stood at the curb and waved until the car vanished around the corner. I didn't go home, though, because I crossed the street to an old cafe next to the hardware store. The owner was a former high school classmate of mine who was now running the establishment with quiet efficiency and a long memory. I leaned in. Close. "Did anyone notice a gray car, is it say? Its license plate 623? He looked up and nodded. "Parked across from your place this morning. Stayed for about 15 minutes before he arrived at the door. But someone had been following your daughter for about half a block." I let that sit for a while, and then thanked him. As I left the cafe, I noticed that my footsteps were steady and that I wasn't running anymore. I had finished what needed to be done, and I was ready. That evening, I watered the garden as usual. The sky was quiet, lavender, and low, and that's when Todd arrived. He was wearing a wrinkled shirt, and I stood just outside the fence. He called to me softly, "We need to talk." I dried my hands on a rag and walked over, keeping the fence between us. His voice was calm. "You're looking for my daughter?" He smiled a little and said, "I'm just worried about her safety." I said, equally, "You took her without time. Me, you didn't anyone. That could be considered kidnapping, detainment, ornament, interfering with a mentally unstable adult. I didn't fall for it, and I cut him off straight as stone. Have you ever wondered why she didn't tell you?" His faltered, altered. "She doesn't want you, Eshisu, sheck afraid of you." I took closer. Closer. "You think I don't know what you did. You don't have proof." For a split second, something flickered eyes. As eyes. "You're just her mother, a retired housewife. You can't beat me." He looked at me for a long time, and his jaw twitched, possibly as a smirk or a threat, before turning and leaving. It wasn't until his gray sedan left the alley and vanished down the street that I finally let out a breath. Back inside the house, I found the doctor's fax letter neatly on the table. The paper was starting to turn yellow, but the handwriting was clear and sharp, and the patient, Joanna Miller, suspected domestic abuse, multiple contusions, and bone fractures. She recommended psychiatric evaluation and independent guardianship. I folded it carefully, slid it into a sealed plastic bag, and locked it inside the drawer. The next step was to file a report, so I stood outside the young officer, possibly in his early 30s, with the exhausted expression of someone who had worked too many long shifts, sat behind the front desk. His name tag read, "Ma'am, may I help? You with something?" I put the plastic evidence bag on the counter and said calmly but resolutely, "I'm here to report a case of domestic abuse and illegal surveillance. The victim is my daughter, and the abuser is her husband, Todd Miller." He looked at the contents of the bag, which included her diagnostic summary, a system screenshot of her emergency room visit, and a written statement from a local nurse. Everything pointed to long-term abuse and psychological control. Nodding, he took out the documents and started going over them one by one, as if he was trying to determine whether the story made sense. He asked, "Where is she, Andu?" And I replied, "She's staying with family in a safe place." He scowled. "You know, without her personal statement and signature, none of this is enough to file formal charges." I lip. My lip. "Did you actually read that summary?" The doctor specifically stated that there was suspicion of domestic abuse, but he said, "Suspected doesn't mean confirmed." He said, "Suspected doesn't mean confirmed, but without moving, and in domestic cases, the line can be complicated. I'm not saying I don't believe you, ma'am. I do. But according to protocol, we need more. I can open an initial situation report if you can get her to call us. If she does, we'll record the statement and attach it to the file. If the hospital complies, we might be able to request an emergency protective order." I nodded. "She will call. I'll make sure she does it today." By the time I got out of the station, the back of my shirt was soaked. I got into the car and dialed Joanna's number right away. Her voice was steadier than I had anticipated, "Mom. Did you file the report?" "I did, and I gave them everything I had. They weren't yet ready to open a case, but they were willing to record your phone call." There was a pause, and then she said, I do it. Tell me what to say, and I'll say it." I went silent for a moment, but now she was willing to speak, even though she used to dread phone calls, especially when they mentioned Todd. "You don't have to say what I tell you," she said. "You just have to tell your truth, or truth across the state." Todd was sitting in the alley behind a bar, holding his phone as if it were going to break. He had just finished a call with the hospital's administrative office, and the person on the other end was distant, courteous, but firm. "We've been contacted by law enforcement regarding wife's visit," she said. "And all the documentation was being preserved can be changed or removed." H clenched, enched. He knew now that Susan was making her move, but he wouldn't go. Down quietly early the following morning, Joanna called the police station, her voice trembling slightly in the recording, but every word rang clear. "This is Miller. Miller, my husband has subjected me to repeated physical and emotional abuse. He locked me in a room, cut me off from the outside world, deleted my call history, controlled my medical records, and stated that something would happen to my mom if I ever went to the police. I sat next to her, listening to every second of her speech, her facial muscles twitching occasionally, her jaw clenching. But she didn't stop. I'm currently staying with my mother's relatives, so I'm safe for the time being, and I'm willing to cooperate with." Joanna turned to me during the call and said, "Mom, you gave courage. Worrage, hiding. I'm not going back into that shell." At Cedar Falls Memorial Hospital, Dr. Patrick had already submitted a full legal medical summary to the hospital's legal department, this time marking the file legally admissible and including Joanna's authorized electronic signature. It contained her ER imaging scans, nurse logs, the physician's written assessment, and, most importantly, a recording of their conversation that evening, during which Joanna stated unequivocally that her husband pushed her. At 4:30 that afternoon, Officer Reed called me back, Mrs. Dawson, and said, "We've received the formal medical report along with your dog recording. See Weeding, we've submitted it to our higher office. The police will now launch an official investigation int Miller, and a temporary protective order has been issued. He is prohibited from coming within 300 feet of either you or Joanna with immediate effect." At first, I did anything. I just took a deep breath as if I'd been holding my breath for weeks, and then I muttered, You, don't think. Me. He said that this happened because you didn't give up, protecting both yourself and your daughter that evening. The official protection documents were delivered to my door by a courier from the station, and I called Joanna to share the news. Later, she boarded a bus from Eugene and returned home, and I sat at the kitchen table and opened a bottle of red wine that I hadn't touched in years. She froze for a moment when I said, "You told the truth in your own voice for the first time," and I gently slid a glass across the table to her. We both grinned and raised our glasses together. The day Todd received the official police summons also happened to be his 37th birthday, and he had planned to take some friends out to dinner that evening to announce his upcoming investment in a tech startup. This was a flashy little move to mark a new chapter, but at noon, a uniformed officer arrived at his office door and handed him the official documents. The officer handed him a red-sealed document and said, "Calmly, you are under investigation for domestic violence, psychological abuse, and medical record tampering. We're requesting your full cooperation." Todd didn't explode, but he froze for a few seconds before responding, "She's makeup. It up? She's unstable." The officer also said, "In addition, your wife authorized full disclosure of her medical records in a recorded call. Several documents now point to a consistent pattern of abuse." Todd said nothing. His eyes dropped, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and he couldn't have talked his way out. Charm or control, the ground was shifting beneath him, and he was powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, Joanna and I sat in a quiet meeting room on the 3rd floor of a law office. She was wearing a soft cotton blouse and her hair was tie-low ponytail, P-tail. Although there was still a H. Palorf Pilar in her face, she was more composed than she had been in weeks. Across us, we sat Miss Harper, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer Tracy had put us in touch with. She didn't waste words, and after quickly going through our stack of documents, she looked up and said, "The police have already secured a temporary arrest order. On day the DA files charges, we can pursue action for action damages for emotional distress and a request to freeze a portion of his assets." Joanna spoke softly. "Will I have to go to court?" Harper nodded. "Prance you havely hearing. You won't?" I reached over and squeezed her hand, saying, "You're not doing this alone." Joanna looked at me, her eyes glassy, but the tears didn't fall this time. A week later, the local news picked up the story, and the headline read, "Suspected coercive abuse case. Enters process, mother helps daughter escape control." They didn't name Todd, but anyone who knew him recognized the profile photo. Right away, his stiff jaw and his signature coat. The side angle was unmistakable that evening. Her voice was full of excitement, and she said, "I'm so glad the truth's out anning out seeing your decipher safe Susan." Smiled into the receiver. "Thank you for sending that message when you did. If it hadn't been for you, it might have been too late." She clicked her tongue. "Next time you file hero paperwork, make sure you include Neighborhood Watch MVP." We both laughed, and this time, Todd didn't get away with it. In the end, police discovered several incriminating emails in his inbox that he had sent to Cedar Falls Memorial staff, asking them to remove inaccurate records and even offering compensation in exchange. These emails became crucial evidence for the prosecution, confirming his attempt to obstruct an investigation. Joanna's formal statement was added to the case, and the court approved the recommendation without hesitation. The trial didn't drag on at all, Todd's lawyer attempted to frame the incident as an emotional conflict and an accident, but that defense quickly crumbled in the face of medical records, diagnostic summaries, phone recordings, and a strict, consistent timeline. He was sentenced to 2 years of probation, mandatory psychological counseling, and restrictions on his public behavior, but his true punishment came elsewhere. The board voted him out of the company, and his social media accounts, which had been buzzing with friends and business contacts, went silent overnight, with some even deleting photos of him completely. There were no jail bars, just the gradual public erasure of a man who believed he was untouchable. Joanna didn't attend the trial that day. Instead, she sat in the backyard. When spring arrived, Joanna started taking online courses in trauma, counseling, and gradually re-establishing a rhythm to her days. I volunteered at the town library, sometimes reading to children and other times holding books. It felt healing. One afternoon, while Joanna and I were out shopping for groceries, we noticed a boy holding an umbrella over his mother. The umbrella was too small, and he was half soaked while she stayed dry. The morning sun was touchy wildflowers at her feet when he texted me, "Mom." I couldn't bear to watch him fall apart, but knowing you're there, that's the victory. Looked at Joanna, who was also watching the boy, and she smiled softly and gently. It was then that I realized he had returned, not just physically, but also in spirit. I remembered that the real Joanna, the kind, clear-eyed, quietly strong girl, was back. When people ask me how I did it, I always respond that I didn't do anything extraordinary, that I don't have a law degree, that I've never been a Mina rights group, that I'm not wealthy, that I'm not powerful, that I live in a small town, and that I'm just a mother. One thing, though, was that I never stopped believing her, even when the world said she was dramatic, fragile, or unstable. It took me a few seconds to realize that I was lying somewhere safe. The room had small white walls, no ceiling fixtures, and a row of plants still, their little green leaves pressing outward toward the light. A breeze slipped through the window crack, cool but not oppressive. I sat up slowly, my neck a little stiff, and the pillow appeared Mom's. I'm Joanna, and I woke up in the sunlight with the curtains open. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who stood behind her and stayed swapped it in last night, just like her to think of, even though I slid my feet over the edge of the bed. The wooden floor was cool under my skin, not cold enough to make my body tense, but cool enough to remind me that I was alive and barefoot. I reached down and put on a pair of thick socks, being careful not to make a sound that would make someone angry. Then I remembered that it was just Mom and me here, without Todd, without anyone to scold me for turning on the light too early, no one to snap, no one to grab my wrist and where the hell you? Undo, and I had to repeatedly explain that I had just taken out the trash. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened from the kitchen. I could hear the soft mom of Mom singing under her breath, the gentle clatter of lids, and the hiss of a kettle starting to boil. Suddenly, I felt like crying. Not because I was sad, but because of something strange that was releasing tension in my chest and pushing outward relief, possibly even peace. I didn't think I'd ever wake up to a morning like this again, but here, it was, and I was in it. I didn't immediately realize that I was trapped, and if you asked me what words should have raised the first red flag, I probably couldn't even add them. I feel it. It felt like the first time someone truly knew me. He would say, "Don't wear that skirt. It's too short. I don't want you catching a chill, and don't go to that coffee shop anymore. Something happened there last week. It's not safe." I had never been in a relationship where someone took care of me like that, or more accurately, took everything I taught it was love. I also did that for maturity control. Shortly after we met, he started ordering for the two of us. He would say, "You love the spicy shrimp pasta," and then place our order without waiting for me to say anything. The year we got married, I was 27 years old. I quit my job because Todd kept saying, "You're always complaining about Joanne Baba boss. Or boss, why don't you take a break? I make enough for both of us." I still remember how I responded. "Really? You're okay with me being a housewife while? While. He smiled in rough hair. Hair? Of course I think you're more valuable at home than anywhere else. And I believed him. However, 6 months later, when I raised the subject of returning to work, his expression changed. He said that I was sleeping in too much, so he changed our blackout curtains. He said that it would help me reestablish my rhythm. He said that I was cooped up in the house too much, so we started going everywhere together, working out, going to the G-store, running errands, and suddenly even going to the store alone felt out of reach. He said that I wasn't good at making friends, so my phone contacts gradually decreased to just him, his mother, and 2 other people. One by one, the rest vanished. And I did notice at first that I made excuses for him. He means that he loves me, but he just expresses it in his own recognized what was actually going on. I couldn't go anywhere without reporting my movements. And I couldn't read a book at night without explaining what it was about. It wasn't love, it was domestication, and everyone thought I was happy. He took me to every party, held my hand, smiled, and introduced me. This is my wife, Joanna. Every time I fell asleep, he put a gentle hand on my back as a loving reminder. But in reality, it cute as a cue fix your face, baby. He would say it while tapping his fingers lightly against my knee, and the sound reminded me of a slow. The day everything changed wasn't even dramatic. Nothing violent happened. I just stared at my phone for a little too long. It was late afternoon, and I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when my phone buzzed on the couch in the living room. I wiped my hands and walked over, and it was Rose, my old college roommate, who had just had a baby and sent me a picture. I didn't cry out back then, thinking that if I just stayed quiet, it would get better. Seconds or less later, Todd emerged from his office and asked, "Who is that?" As if it meant nothing. I said, "My college friend just had a baby." I smiled and put the phone down, thinking, "You're right?" "She was at our wedding." He nodded, but his eyes changed, and I blinked. No, not because we hadn't seen each other in 6 months. I froze, and only then did I realize how close he was standing. I just thought the baby was cute, but he didn't. After I finished the dishes and returned to the bedroom, he was sitting on the edge of the bed with my phone. The screen was unlocked, asked, "Did you change your passcode?" I tried to remain calm, but the old one stopped working, and you didn't think to tell me. You know how much I hate being kept in the dark. I wasn't hiding anything. I just didn't. Wait for me to finish. And when he threw the phone hard onto the bed, I jumped at the sound. My entire body flinched when he said, "You're lying." His voice had a tone that chilled me to the bone. I opened my mouth to explain, but nothing came out. Then he shoved me, and I hit the wall hard enough to cause everything inside to shift, but not hard enough to break anything. A flash of white flashed across my vision, and it felt like a hidden switch had been flipped in the back of my mind. He continued to accuse me of betrayal, of betraying his trust, and of being dishonest, but I couldn't hear a word of it. I slid down the wall, clutching my chest, not out of pain, but because I was unable to breathe. He had said those things before, but this was the first time he had put his hands on me. I did nothing because I had run out of options that evening. I sat on the living room floor long after he had gone to bed, waiting in silence, barely breathing, and then I picked up my phone and turned it on. Instead of calling the police or texting Rose, I just opened my notes app and typed the line, "This is not what marriage is supposed to be." Then I turned off the screen and curled up in the shadow, under the couch, holding my knees like a child waiting for morning. Time passed quickly after that. I timed it down to the moment I waited in the bathroom, listening to Ted, for the sound of the car pulling away, the engine disappearing around the corner, and then I stepped out. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you scream or SOB, but rather the kind that hollowed you out from the inside, a quiet terror cold and sticky. I leaned against the bathroom door, gripped my phone like it was a piece of driftwood, backed up one password-protected folder to my email, And all I could do was put the hospital report in my nightstand drawer, because to be honest, I didn't think anyone was coming until I heard her voice. My mom was standing in the doorway wearing her old trench coat, her hair pulled back tight, not panicked or breathless, just ready. I nearly started crying, but she put her arms around me and held me close without saying anything. We started packing as if she had already done it before finding the hidden report without my pointing out, and she assisted me in gathering clothes. Queeths we didn't take much in case he noticed anything missing. The room I thought was my sanctuary was the mirror where I'd written, "Just hold on a little long red lipstick and stick," the bed where I'd cried into the pillow night after night, and I paused as I looked back at the apartment. I didn't cry or linger. Instead, I turned to my mother and said, "Let's go," as the car pulled away from the street. I kept my head down, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I didn't want her to see me, because I knew if she looked too closely, all apart, and once the dam broke, I wasn't sure I could put myself back together. She turned around and reached for my hand, her fingers gently wrapping around mine, and I was unable to contain the tears that came quickly and hard. They were the kind of tears you can't stop, Orse Mom. "Ow, Mom," I choked, I tried. "Weak? Weak, I tried," she said softly. I've always known that I sobbed, but I was too ashamed to even admit it to myself. She didn't say, "Don't cry, okay?" "It's okay." She simply held my hand solid as if to say, "You're crazy, your problem. You just haven't been pulled to shore yet, and now I'm here." She didn't push me. Instead, she cooked and cleaned the house, and occasionally she sat next to me while the TV hummed in the background. She never asked when I'd be ready to talk, but I knew she was waiting. I was kept silent, not out of fear, but out of shame that I couldn't look her in the eye. When she turned to go into the kitchen, I would steal glances at her face to see if she was. It tore at me like a match soaked in water meant to spark, desperate to burn but sputtering a slow, sticky smoke. Not fire ash. Even ash just stuck some between. One night, I couldn't hold it any longer. I turned to her and said, "Mom, I knew he was controlling me for a long time." She was surprised. She just asked gently, and then I looked, asking, "Why did you leave?" "You leave?" I was disappointed whether she thought I'd wasted her effort, her worry, or her trip, but she simply stayed without questioning or placing blame. She sat next to me and held my hand, "Joanna," and she said softly but definitely, "The fact that you can say this out loud already makes you bravest. Not a failure. You're not the problem. You're just a girl who spent too long carrying the weight of someone else's mistakes." My voice cracked as I said, "I thought it was my fault because I didn't make money, I didn't have friends, and I was bad at social and emotional stuff." I said, "I'm 36, Mom. I'm not a girl." She pulls me into her arms and whispering, she said, "Let me owe you childhood. Let me give it back." The days that followed were difficult. I began therapy, contacted old friends, worked on my resume, practiced for online teaching interviews, and tried not to worry about what the neighbors thought. I also avoided the news comment sections where my name might be buried, but I knew it wasn't realistic because some nights I still woke up gasping and whispering "I'm sorry" into the dark. Those apologies weren't for Todd. They were for me, for every year I stayed, and for every boundary I let slip. A few days later, when I went with Mom to return some books to the town library, the girl at the desk smiled and asked, "Are you Madison? Dawson's daughter?" She comes in all the time and helps us organize the children's section. I froze for a half second before nodding yes, and then I said, "Yes." For the first time, I ever claimed an identity in public without flinching, not as someone's wife or shadow, but as someone's daughter. "I'm sorry forever." That's the most honest response I can give myself. I'm Joanna Dawson, and I'm alive and building a new life. Sometimes I think about talking about him, but not with anger or longing, just distance. He was a time and an end, and he closed the door on the most chaotic decade of my life. I am so incredibly grateful for the version of me that once wrote in the dark, "This is not what marriage should be." I realize that identity isn't something that people assign you, it's something you claim. If she hadn't written that, I might still be telling myself to wait a little while longer. But that one sentence was the last spark that would not go out. Mom once told me after I got home that her biggest fear was not that Todd would come looking for me, but that one day I would say he wasn't that bad. I laughed when she said that, and I took her hand and held it tight because I'm done being someone else's excuse. I want to be someone who owns her life. She looked at me, and then something shone in her eyes. Neither of us said anything else, but I knew she heard me this morning, so I hung my bed. I stood there watching the white sheets sway, gently in the wind like they were waving at me, Joanna. I whispered to myself, "What you have now is freedom. Not the kind you run toward after escaping someone else, but the kind you stay for because you chose it for yourself." The light was perfect. The breeze on the balcony drifted through like a quiet blessing, drying more than just cotton and linen, and it dried the shame, fear, and self-doubt I'd carried for so long. Since I stopped waiting for approval to live, I've realized that there is still more to come, including rebuilding, learning to trust, starting relationships, letting people in, and possibly getting hurt or falling in love with someone who doesn't deserve it. However, I'm no longer afraid because I am no longer the woman waiting. I've returned to someone else to tell her who she is. I am Joanna, a woman who is standing in the sun,